Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is all around assessing the economic impact of supported learning programs in profitable grazing systems. My name is Julie Petty, and this webinar was held live on the 5th of September. We've just re-recorded it as there were some issues with the first recording. So what we'll do is we'll make sure we cover off on all the same questions that were asked, and I'll introduce our guest speakers today, which is Basil from Macquarie Franklin and Ian from Bush Agribusiness, who are going to be talking us through this assessment of the economic impact. So, Basil, on to you.
Thanks, Julie. I just want to talk a little bit about comparative analysis as a subset of benchmarking. So when we talk about benchmarking, we're talking about a whole learning process, which generally starts with comparative analysis, which is the data and the numbers. In the comparative analysis process, we generally identify what the top producers are doing, top 10, top 20%, and we compare that to average. And what we're looking for is areas of improvement. So we can say that the average is achieving this level, but we know that a higher level is attainable because we've got people within the data set already doing that. One of the problems with comparative analysis is it identifies potentially what you need to do differently, but it doesn't tend to identify how you go about that. So the next step is then delving into other people's businesses, recognising that your own set of resources or business is different, and then adapting that technology or technique back to your own business. Within the project, within PGS, comparative analysis is built into the curriculums as an option, and we're encouraging project proponents to have a go at hanging some numbers on the benefit of the skill development within their individual projects. So critical components of comparative analysis are an opportunity to investigate the key profit drivers of the business, and in particular the ones you're addressing through the projects that you're putting up and through the skill development process. And the outcomes that we're looking for are that participants know where their business sits relative to industry, average and best, or a subset of that that's more regionally focused, whatever's relevant. That participants are more aware of the gaps in their knowledge. So firstly saying at a key performance indicator level, I'm not performing where I ought to be. What training or capacity development do I need to undertake to be able to improve that? We'd like to improve their ability to process data and convert that from just raw data into information and knowledge, and an ability to evaluate decisions from an economic perspective. So I'm just going to hand over to Ian now, who's going to run us through assessing the economic impact.
Thank you, Basil. Brief overview there of what I'll be talking about today with regard to assessing economic impact. Starting off by understanding what our current performance or baseline data is, being clear on what is the issue being addressed, what the benefits are that are going to result from that, what additional costs will be incurred, asking ourselves the question of what will be different to the status quo, and then have a look at some of the analysis methods. I think it's very important to have a good understanding of current business or group performance if we're going to look at assessing economic impact. And with the project called Profitable Grazing Systems, it's important we understand as best we can where we're at, and that the interventions resulting are going to increase profits. So, and without that, I think it's very difficult to do it. Having that information lets us know what the current performance of the business is, what its strengths and weaknesses are, and helps the areas for change can be identified and prioritised. And I think that's important because different businesses and even groups of businesses will have strengths and weaknesses in different areas. Therefore, they'd be better off addressing some areas and not others, and it's important to know what they are. So a couple of options are detailed management accounts and or comparative analysis reports, as Basil has referred to, and industry average data. So the comparative analysis reports or business analysis reports are externally prepared, detailed historical analysis of the performance of the business and its enterprises. And these are done professionally by specialist service providers. There's a number of which that do it. And that provides very good information on how the business is performing at a big picture, but also at an enterprise level, what its strengths are and what its weaknesses are. There's an important part of that is that I think the first and the biggest benefit of that is just knowing how the business is performing in its own right and how that's changing over time and measuring change over time. Comparisons to others in the industry or the top performers is useful, but that's secondary to understanding how the business is performing in its own right. Secondly, in the absence of those reports, or even with them, I think it's important to have detailed management accounts consisting of a reconciled livestock inventory and a good understanding of the cost structure of the business. So if we're going to be talking again about profitable grazing systems, this is an area I think that the grazing business managers of the future will be do very well. So with regard to the reconciled livestock inventory, livestock numbers isn't just a matter of pulling out your notebook and saying we had X head on the place last year. We need to be able to get those numbers to balance over the year. And what I mean by that is that our opening numbers, plus our purchases, plus our natural increase, less our sales, less our deaths equals our closing. They will have in reality out in the paddock, assuming the neighbours are honest. So it's important that we've got the records there to reconcile that, firstly at a whole herd or flock level, and then on a class-by-class basis. Without that information, we cannot get a handle on what the reproductive rate of the herd or flock is, what the mortality rate is over time, or what our grazing load is, all of which are key bits of information in managing a grazing business. The next aspect there is a good understanding of the cost structure of the business. This is just having a good set of good chart of accounts, so the business is able to draft the expenses up or the expenditure up into different areas to get a good understanding of the cost structure. The income, unfortunately, is a lot easier to get a handle on because there's only a couple of lines for income. The expenses are a lot more detailed, and it's important to have that broken up. I suggest in terms of, firstly, the operating expenses. So what does it cost to run the business year to year? And we break these up even further into enterprise expenses for each enterprise that we run. So if we've got a fine wool and a beef operation, or goats and beef, we record the enterprise expenses or the direct costs or variable costs, the terms are interchangeable, for each of the enterprises up and record them separately. And then we have the overhead costs, which are the general running costs of the business, the rates, the rents, the fuel, the wages, and that sort of thing. Even for a single enterprise business, it's important to have that distinction between what is the enterprise expenditure and what is the overhead expenditure, because it does give us a good understanding of the cost structure of the business and makes analysis possible. Next is finance costs. An important distinction: the cost of finance, such as bank charges and interest, are not a cost of running the business, they're a cost of financing the business. So we want to have that recorded separately. Capital expenditure: what's our reinvestment into the business year to year in terms of infrastructure, improvements, plant, vehicles, etc. Having that drafted out and seeing that is important, I think. The owner costs, I prefer to see wages, if it's a remuneration for effort, included in operating expenses, but there may be things like school fees and other things caught up down here. And also taxation expense, which no one likes, but it was also a sign of a very healthy business if there is tax being paid. So having the cost structure of the business broken up in that way not only is it something that producers can do largely independently? It gives them a good understanding of what their cost structure is. If a business has 3 or 5 years of their expenditure broken up against those headings on one page, you've got good information on what their cost structure is and how it's changing over time. And it also does make assessing the economic impact possible. In the absence of that data, also to complement that data as well, there's some good resources out there on industry average and also top performing businesses. So there's the situation analyses that Meat and Livestock Australia commissioned a few years ago for northern beef and southern lamb, which give a good snapshot of the industry, where it's at, what the issues are and what the better performers are doing, all of which will be useful within the Profitable Grazing Systems project in terms of assessing economic impact. There's also ABARES data, which through the ABARES website, but there's also an MLA portal where you can access business data from across Australia. And it is quite a good resource for regional information. There's the Farm Monitor report, there's the Home Sacket reports, and there'll be others as well, which give good information on industry performance, what the top performers are doing, which will help you in identifying the issues or profit drivers for what you're doing. Using the industry average data and the identified issues and profit drivers is not ideal. Having that information for the businesses or groups you're working with is ideal, but in the absence of that information, it's defendable to use industry averages and identified profit drivers. So in terms of assessing economic benefit, this is it at its simplest. And at the end of the day, it is quite simple, and you need to avoid overcomplicating it, which I think can happen. Some people think it's very complicated, and we can make it too complicated, but at its most simplest, it's saying, well, what are the incremental or marginal benefits? So what we mean by incremental or marginal is what's going to occur that we're not getting at the moment as a result of whatever it is we're doing. And then also, what are the incremental or marginal costs we don't have at the moment. Then it's simply a matter of asking the question of, do the benefits sufficiently outweigh the costs, accounting for the timing of the cash flows, risk of the investment, and alternative uses of that capital. That's it at its most simplest. So a good point to start, I think, is being very clear on what the specific issue is that is being addressed, having that documented. This is where I think referring to the situation and analyses and other resources I just went through are good, because they give a good snapshot for the different industries across different regions with regard to what the issues and profit drivers are. From a northern or extensive focus, which is where I work, the key issues usually are, in about 80% of cases, these are the main ones to focus, is increasing the per animal productivity, so kilos of beef per adult equivalent, better targeting or optimising our enterprise expenditure, getting more back than we're spending on the herd, improving labour efficiency, or addressing economies of scale. Addressing one or more of them is usually the top priority for northern or extensive businesses, but it's important to know which one. I'll just ask Basil to add more detail to the southern businesses.
Thanks, Lynn. So, yeah, Port South, pretty similar. Obviously, biggest area for improvement, key driver of business performance is pasture harvest. It currently sits at about 30 to 40% of biological optimum. The only way to harvest more feed is increase stocking rate, and to do that, it's either more animals per hectare or more production per animal. And either of those options, it can be different at a farm business level. Second one is lowering cost of production on a per kilogram of live weight basis, and I think that is, in terms of lowering cost of production, probably better described the way they have it in the north there, a better targeted enterprise expenditure. So there is a case to be made for increasing cost of production as red meat price increases to continue to improve profit, but again, very strong link between lower cost of production and operating profit, and so cost of production kind of barrels up operating profit and risk to some extent. Third one there is labour use efficiency, so that's similar to the north or exactly the same. And the fourth one there, a little bit different. Not so many economies of size or economies of scale to be grabbed, but definitely a case to be made for growing a profitable business basically by franchising it.
Thanks, Basil. So next question is to ask us, what are the benefits that are going to result from the management change that is being implemented? Like I said, this is pretty simple stuff, but this is as simple as it gets and as it should be. What are we going to get? Are we going to be able to run more stock? Are we going to get increased productivity from our existing stock? Are we going to be able to reduce our enterprise expenditure? Are we going to reduce our ongoing labour requirements? Are we going to reduce our overhead costs, or what else will it be? And what is the timing of those benefits? Will we see it all immediately or within the first year? Or is it something that we have to wait a number of years to see the benefits flow through to the business from? Being clear on that is an important starting point, and then obviously we need to be able to put a dollar figure on that if we're going to assess whether the benefits outweigh the costs. So next question is, what additional costs will be incurred to achieve that benefit? What is the timing of those costs? Do we have a significant upfront capital investment in a infrastructure, piece of equipment or new technology, or is it an ongoing operating cost through an animal health or supplementation intervention? Being clear on that is important because that affects how we do analyse it. Are we going to have increased herd expenditure, such as the animal health or supplementation example? Will we have increased labour requirements? Will we have increased overhead costs, or what else will it be? What costs will we incur to achieve it? Important to have that, and again, quantify it financially. A good way to look at this, because it can be difficult, is saying what will be different to the status quo. So I've got this business operating as it is at the moment. If we're going to be implementing a management change, what's going to be different as a result of that? Because that's what we're after, the incremental or marginal change, and then that can help us to identify what the costs and benefits are to the business. Then in terms of analysis methods, quick overview of the main ones. Gross margin budgets is something most people will be familiar with. Quite popular because they're simple and easy to do. So if the intervention is going to result in increased income, either through increased productivity price and it's going to have a change in the direct herd expenditure, then we can do a gross margin budget. However, if our overheads are going to be affected, then the gross margin won't give a full picture. And that's an important question to ask, and again, why it's good to have a good understanding of the cost structure of the business. If we're going to be doing another management intervention or one less management intervention, does that reduce the overall labour requirements of the business and associated fuel, vehicle costs, etc.? If so, then the gross margin won't give the full picture because overheads will be affected, in which case we do a full budget analysis, which is more detailed and accounts for the changes in overheads as well. So we get down to the incremental profit level, whereas gross margin is a step towards getting to the operating profit level. The next one is a cost-benefit analysis. So this is better suited to where there's a significant upfront investment and resulting future cash flows. It brings all of those cash flows back to today's dollars. So we can ask the question, well, are we getting sufficiently more back in today's dollars than what it's costing us to justify the investment? And the measures that are generated there are the net present value, internal rate of return, years break even, benefit cost ratio. So if we've got a number of investment options and those measures against each of them, then we can assess them there. Won't go into them in a lot of detail. There's a lot of good resources out there on them in finance texts and even through online resources. And Excel has good functionality to help you work them out if you've got the good baseline data to use. So, in summary, estimating the economic impact of the changes you make is going to require a good understanding of current performance, and then what the changes to that business from what you're doing, how that will affect the business. Then it's a matter of saying what are the expected benefits and likely costs from the activity, and then do the benefits sufficiently outweigh the costs, accounting for the timing of cash flows, risk of the investment and alternative uses of that capital. Probably an important point on that alternative uses of that capital is that if we're going to be investing money in the business, either in terms of ongoing operating expenses or a significant capital investment, there are alternative uses for that. It could be put in the bank, it could be used to pay off debt, so we need to account for that or take into account the opportunity cost. And it's another important thing which we don't have time to get into too much detail here is what is the cost of capital in the business. But in summary, if the business is able to pay money off debt and earn itself as a long-term average, 7%, be less than that at the moment as a long-term average, then that's the minimum hurdle that alternative uses of that capital must get over. I'd even raise it a bit to account for the riskiness of not putting it in there, but that's an important consideration. And again, we're trying to look into a crystal ball here. So the analysis will only be as accurate as the assumptions used. So the more input you get into them from different people, the more robust they'll be. And it's worthwhile to go through a best case, worst case, most likely scenario to have a look at the range of results and how changes in some of the assumptions affect the overall results. So I'll hand over to Julie now for some questions.
Thanks, Ian. So the first question comes back to that comment about the benefits significantly outweighing the costs. And you mentioned, that has to be higher or better than the other alternatives. I guess that's up to an individual's perspective about what their expectation is that?
It is, but obviously if we've got a number of options lined up, we can see how they're going. If we're spending $100 and getting $101 back, then that's probably not enough. If we're spending $100 and getting $200 back, then that's good. But it is up to the individual and where they're at. But obviously the more the better. And if we've got a number of options there, going through this process will help people identify which is likely to give them the most bang for their buck and focusing their efforts on that.
How do you guys find producers are reacting to getting this involved in their financials and looking at closely? Is it something people are keen to do or a bit hesitant?
Well, I'd have to say hesitant because we've only got about 15% of the primary producers engaged in comparative analysis and or benchmarking. But at the same time, there's probably limited capacity for them to engage. And most primary producers are fairly technically, operationally focused, so they're not always wanting to sit down and do loads and loads of figures. But I think at the end of the day, going into the future, to be able to keep growing the business in an environment where costs are probably increasing quicker than product price over the long term, that it's going to be more a way of doing business. But having that opportunity to also link those numbers to deficiencies in capability or opportunities to improve is the key to engaging producers in that space.
If as a service provider you're not feeling all that comfortable in this space, what are your options in terms of upskilling in this sort of area so you feel more comfortable in talking to producers about this comparative analysis?
Yeah, look, at the project level, we've got the leadership group, and there's an opportunity to gain some assistance there in terms of hanging some financial numbers on the potential benefit of the project, and we are encouraging a marginal cost, marginal return focus to training. So that's being able to hang numbers on, say, things like feeding versus red meat production, and then converting those to financial numbers so that, you know, primary producers are able to see an agronomic or a nutritional response, but they have the opportunity to convert that into a financial or economic benefit or cost. And then I guess at a higher level, the opportunity to undertake formal training as well.
Thanks, Basil. Ian, you mentioned that there is some general industry data and whatnot available. How regionally specific does that drill down to? You mentioned it's not ideal, but it would certainly be an option.
Some regions are better represented than others through the different sources. The ABARES does provide quite good representative regional data from across Australia. So I think it'd be a matter of looking at what's available for where you operate or nearby regions and getting a good understanding of that. And I think that's important, not just from a baseline data point of view, but those reports that we identified have some quite good information on what the issues are, what the profit drivers are, and what should be addressed and what differentiates the top 25%. So they're a good resource to understand the economic performance of businesses.
Yeah, and I'd agree with Ian there that at certainly for the south, at the key performance indicator level, those numbers are incredibly robust. You know, the absolutes mightn't be there, but you know, the areas for improvement, and certainly a lot of those areas are the areas that projects are going to target, because inherently there is a higher return in targeting those key performance indicator areas. So I think they're very robust. Moving that from robust justification of putting up a project to a benefit to an individual producer is where you really need to move to that individual farm business analysis.
Thanks, Basil. And the final question, the comparative analysis at the moment is a highly recommended but voluntary part of profit grazing systems. Is that likely to change in the future?
I guess at this point in time, we've made it optional because not everyone's trained in that area, and so it's going to take a bit of time. We want to instill a continuous business improvement model within the project, so that's a reason for starting the process around some comparative analysis, starting to put some benefit costs around project delivery and improve farm performance, and also through the skills auditing process where it's not just the participants who are being audited, but that's a reflection of the training capability of the deliverer, and we don't want to see that as being judgmental, but rather just part of an improvement process. So I guess ultimately funders will make a call on whether they make that compulsory. For me, if anyone's investing money with you, you do have some sort of obligation to demonstrate a return.
Okay, thanks very much, Basil and Ian, and all our participants for your time. We'll wrap up and end the webinar there. There is another webinar coming up on the 20th of September, which is all around giving you a bit more information about recruiting producers and the different feeder activities that will be available in the program. So you're very welcome to join us for that, and keep an eye out for the advertising that will be coming through for it. And we can also provide a bit of an update as to what is happening in terms of the state-based coordinators. So I'll just find the slide for that. Apologies. So you can see that update just there on your screen. There'll be more information coming out about that and contact information for those guys. as we keep rolling the program forward. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us.